I am trying in every which way to try to understand, okay, as best as I can, the times that we are in. I think we are in an extraordinary, unique moment in American society, politically, culturally, intellectually, and in many ways, and I'm trying to get a handle on this. So I do a lot of reading about this, and I use the platform to sort of massage my thoughts and try to gain some clarity from different perspectives to try to interpret the moment that we are in and ways in which I think we need to respond to what are the dangers, political dangers, that we confront in American life. I should say it's no accident for those of you who have been here and listened to my talks through the many years. My mind is sort of formatted around a type of sociological understanding of social and human behavior, but also I have a fascination and love for the history of ideas. And this address brings together those two different perspectives. And I've entitled it Democracy, Fact, Truth, and Reason. Central to ethical culture is the absence of a creed, at least in the traditional religious sense. But ethical culture clearly holds to certain principles and values that help to define it. Primary is respect for the dignity of all people. But also very important to ethical culture is a commitment to reason and a commitment to the well-being of others. Commensurate with our humanism is putting a premium on rational thought and a belief in science as the best way to enhance human knowledge. We assume that the beliefs we hold should be based on evidence and facts rather than on wishful thinking. And ethical cultures, I would say, value a life lived with honesty, integrity, and a devotion to being truthful. And beyond that, seeking out the truth to the extent to which the truth can be known to us. Politically speaking, since its founding in 1876, ethical culture has promoted democracy as the best form of government. These values emanate from our focal commitment, again, to human dignity, because one might conclude that there is not much dignity in a life that is not rooted in a respect for honesty, truthfulness, the edifying and uplifting value of searching for truth and employing facts, evidence, and reason to help get us there. Beyond enhancing appreciation for the dignity of all, we might conclude that these values, including democratic participation, are the best foundations to enable human flourishing, which is also a defining goal and purpose of ethical culture. Ethical culture aims at creating a rich life for you, for me, and everyone guided by these values. Given that we prize these values, and for many of us we try to build our lives around them, the current climate we are in must be particularly upsetting. And beyond that, our times, I conclude, threaten what we hold most dear and perhaps even our sense of security. I know it does for me when I survey our current political situation and I contemplate the future of American society, the global community, and beyond that, the fate of our planet. However volatile American society has been in my lifetime, I think of what comes to mind first and foremost are urban riots, assassinations of political leaders, the protests of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights era, and the ongoing racial oppressions which are endemic in American society. However great the factionalism and even hatred in America, I simply cannot recall a time when the most fundamental, basic underpinnings of society, indeed any society, have been so challenged by so many. When reason, science, the authority of facts, and what is essentially true has been so frontally dismissed, ignored, and attacked, okay? And we are bombarded with this irrationalism and the dissolution and disavowal and dismissal of facts and truth, and so we're bombarded with it 24/7 on the media, okay? As many have noted, we live in a so-called post-truth, post-fact age. It feels as if reality, to me, has lost its moorings, society has fallen down a rabbit hole, and I would argue that no society can endure for long unless certain baseline realities and facts are publicly held in common. Of course, Donald Trump, ostensibly the world's most powerful man, is the primary purveyor of this post-truth, post-fact phenomenon. It has become a parlor game among the media and pundits to count the number of lies that Donald Trump has perpetrated. Michiko Kakutani, who is the former book review editor for the New York Times, in a recent volume she wrote called The Death of Truth, which I did read last year, counted, in fact, 2,140 lies in Trump's first year in office alone. There have been many more, of course, since then. Not only is global warming a Chinese hoax, he contends, but most recently, have you caught this fact? Most recently, he's claimed the noise from wind turbines causes cancer. Okay. I'm glad he's an oncological researcher. We have come to expect, right, we have come to expect this. It's funny at some point, because we've come to expect this. We have come to expect this, and the time, I think, is long past when we are shocked by Trump's lies. In fact, he lies as he breathes, okay? And Trump's assaults on the truth, not only flat-footed lies, but also, Trump assaults the truth, not only through flat-footed lies, but also by creating what you might call an aura of ambiguity with such phrases that he often employs as, quote, "I've heard people say," or "some say," or "many say," that he often invokes. Again, it creates an environment of divisive doubt. Being truthful or not, I think, is not the issue for Donald Trump. His bold-faced lying is rather, I believe, an assertion of power. In other words, he says implicitly, I can say whatever I please, and truth and the facts be damned. Okay, it's an assertion of power, not something that really relates to basically truth or the lack of it. But Trump arguably is not the prevailing cause of the post-truth phenomenon. He is emblematic of a much broader, deeper, and older phenomenon that will still be with us once he departs from the scene. The fact that the entire Republican Party has fallen prey to his mendacity, and what is most gallingly, the leadership of the party refuses to stand up to it, and his base seems not to care, bespeaks a much wider phenomenon than just the derangement of one individual, however powerful he may be. The fact that so many, in effect, don't care about the fact that he's the president's on, I find the most disturbing, if not the most frightening, aspect of this whole political phenomenon. Trump represents an especially extreme example, but a case can be made, and has been made, that ambiguity about truth is in fact endemic to the nature of democracy. It's a very hard point to make, but this is really what I want to talk about, that a certain ambiguity about democracy, about truth, is actually built in to the nature in which democracy in America is structured. In other words, democracy and truth necessarily don't fit together very well, and the problems we are experiencing now actually have, in effect, historically very long roots in the way in which democracy functions. By its very nature, democracy has always had, and will have to some degree, a problem with truth. I'm trying to sort of set the groundwork historically for the emergence of the Trump phenomenon, which is an extreme, very extreme and dangerous case. This premise is laid out, the fact that democracy always has some difficulty with truth, is laid out in a new book by a University of Pennsylvania historian of ideas by the name of Sophia Rosenfeld. Her book is entitled Democracy and Truth. It's a short book, which I did read. It's not an easy read. It's a very concise, tight book. In her short book, Rosenfeld concludes that if we take a long look into history, that the assault on truth may have its roots in the nature, again, of democracy itself. She goes on to elaborate in great detail why the process of democracy has always created a relationship to truth that is fragile and very contested. But she does agree and does conclude that there are ominous dimensions to the current post-truth phenomenon that we witness that are unique to our times and are very distressing and dangerous and need to be addressed. What is new is the depth to which truth is assaulted in our democracy. In her view, there are two types of truth. The first type of truth is based on logic or on solid facts. It is simply true that it is either raining or it's not raining. Okay? That's a fact. It's either raining or not raining, and there can't be any doubt in that. That's logically given, right? Like a triangle has three sides. I mean, that's true, right? You can't doubt that. Or it's a fact that the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County is located in Teaneck, right? More significantly, it is a fact that evolution and natural selection is a correct way to describe the emergence of new species, or that global warming is taking place and human agency plays a role in it. These are one kind of truth that make reference to facts that are, we might argue, are reasonably objective, even very objective if they're logical, and reasonably objective if they're scientific predications. But there are other truths that are not so clear, and are more subject to interpretation, debate, and being contested. So, for example, If experts, and this is an example she gives, if experts in official Washington or the news media tell us that the economy is doing very well, and they predicate that as a fact, you'll hear it on the news, okay, and point to the fact that unemployment is now down to 3.8%, the lowest since 1969, those ostensibly are facts. But what is central to Rosenfeld's analysis is that those facts, central to our analysis is the question, namely, whose facts are these? In other words, who controls and promotes the facts? Okay, that question is really basic to democracy. We're getting sort of a little deep here. That's basic democracy. The fact that the unemployment rate is 3.8% may in a sense be true. But what it masks is the deeper reality that many people have stopped looking for work, okay, and have dropped out of the labor force altogether. Such a low unemployment rate should be a source of happiness. But if you look beneath the surface of all those employed Americans and ask yourself, what is the nature of their employment, their work, as they experience it, you would probably come away with different conclusions. Yes, many people may be employed now who were not employed 3 years ago. But at the same time, their felt experience in their work situation may be one of very high anxiety. More than 40% of all Americans have fewer than $400 in savings, which means that they are only one medical episode or car breakdown from financial panic. More Americans may be employed, but vast numbers are working in crappy jobs that are subcontracted for minimal wages, with no security, no benefits, no vacations, with minimal opportunities for advancement, and I would guess with minimal respect. The experts far away in Washington may pronounce a low unemployment rate, but the people on the ground many experience the nature of their employment in such a way that they may come to different conclusions as to where the truth really lies. This reality may even raise the question of what counts for work. Again, the bureaucrats in Washington and economists may have a certain model of what work is when they make their pronouncements, okay? But it's a fact, one might argue, that is open to interpretation depending on your experience and where you stand on the social hierarchy, so to speak. This is one example relating to the truth of the American economy that raises questions of who determines what is true or not, and opens the door to Rosenfeld's thesis about the nature of truth and democracy. I find it a very interesting thesis, and in brief, it goes as follows. 400 years ago, when Europe was ruled by monarchs and the church, the truth was in the hands of the rulers, and it served the power interests of the rulers to keep the truth away from the people who were uneducated, most often illiterate, ruled by their passions, so it was assumed, and not to be trusted. There were the rulers and the ruled, and rulers were committed to maintaining their power by sustaining secrets, being untransparent, and literally by deception. Anybody who reads Machiavelli in the 15th century knows that the prince maintains his power through deception. Okay, and so that was part of being a ruler, part of being ruled. Then the Enlightenment came in the 18th century and instituted a new set of revolutionary values. The Enlightenment challenged established churches, the monarchs, and the rulers. The philosophers of the Enlightenment maintained, according to Rosenfeld, that no single individual or institution should, quote, hold a monopoly on determining what counts as truth in public life, end quote. The Enlightenment thinkers put a premium on the values of openness, transparency, sincerity, freedom of expression, and unfettered debate. But this was an ideal, and in no sense was the Enlightenment egalitarian. It did not live up to those values. Many of the Enlightenment's most influential thinkers had little but contempt for uneducated people and wanted to restrict the pursuit of truth to a learned elite. Okay. This division played a role in how constitutions of the 18th century were structured, including our own. The American founding fathers did not, despite what you're taught in elementary school, the founding fathers of our country did not create the United States as a democracy that would give equal say to all, but as a republic. Okay, very different idea politically, but as a republic, which in the words of James Madison, the main author of our Constitution, would be ruled by, quote, men, and we mean men who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of society. In other words, our Constitution is structured in such a way as to, in effect, give the ruling power to the elites rather than to the people as a whole. And as we all know, in terms of the franchise, it was only relegated to a small elite sector of society. That is white, unenslaved males, right, who were property owners. I think it was not until 1826 in Massachusetts where people who were not property, men who were not property, actually gained the right to vote. It was a small elite, okay? Jefferson often spoke of some small segment of Americans fit to lead as, quote, the natural aristocracy, okay? And it is instructive for us to remember that the founders allowed for the direct election of the people, okay, by the people, of only one half of one of the three branches of government. That is the House of Representatives. The Senate would follow that, but it took more than 100 years before we had the direct election of senators. Only one half of one house was given over to the will of the people. The rest, in effect, was chosen by, again, those who held to greater social status, what we might call, what Jefferson called, in effect, a natural aristocracy, who were meant to be the rulers. The very structures of society led to a separation of society, therefore, into two classes of people, the ruling elites and what we might call the ordinary folks, what Sarah Palin went on to call the real Americans. Okay, that's a continuation. That's the point. It's a continuation of this historical structure that is put into place, right? Transmogrified into the crudest form. This division in the 19th century morphed into the rise of the expert. As societies have become more complex, they have become far more dependent on experts who possess specialized knowledge, among them economists, statisticians, engineers, architects, lawyers, and scientists of various types. Society needs these experts who exert a certain type, and this is the point, a certain type of authority and express their own truths, which is a source of their power. This is where different versions of the truth emerge, which Rosenfeld contends, again, is inherent in our democracy. I'm being clear. We have two classes of people. We have the elites and the experts on the one hand, and ordinary just folks on the other who look at reality and society very differently and therefore come to different conclusions as to what might count as a fact, what might count as true, and so on and so forth. Okay. In a review of Rosenfeld's book in The Nation magazine, an observer, David Bell, says, quote, the authority that experts enjoy can lead them to retreat into a bubble in which they are insulated from public judgment and criticism, and over time they can devolve into privileged interest groups as scornful and condescending towards ordinary people as the most snobbish of the founders, end quote. Okay? Just a few examples here, and I'll give you an example from my own experience. As someone who has one foot in academia, I truly lament the reality that academia and what goes on in the ivory tower is so walled off from society in general and the interests of the common man or the common woman. Parents will pay today, and I think it's an irony, they will pay huge amounts of money. Now we learn that they'll bribe college officials as well, right, to get their kids into top colleges. But I suspect few of these parents have any idea of what goes on behind college walls, and most probably care less as long as their kids get a diploma, which is a ticket into the upper echelons of society. I'm talking about the top schools. I suspect a good number of wealthy parents hold university professors to whom they entrust the education of their children in gross contempt, given the relatively meager salaries that professors earn. But if the wealthy classes, and this is the point, see higher education per se in such jaded terms, more to the point is that there is a broad-based contempt coming from the less privileged classes of society. A majority, a Pew survey just recently found out, and I find that this is, I mean, we can't be a great country any longer. The Pew survey found that a majority of Republicans, and we have to think now of primarily Trump's cohorts in this regard, now declare, and hold the opinion, that colleges and a university education is bad for America. I mean, what happens when they go to the doctor? I mean, don't they want their doctor to have a medical degree? I mean, this is where we have come in this regard, right? It is, I believe, an expression of contempt for elites, and contempt which marks a major division in society, right? Now, I should say, to some degree, to be fair, I think the colleges have brought this on themselves. I think that in many universities, there is a type of, the contempt goes both ways, that university culture very often is contemptuous of the people at large. And a lot of discourse that goes on in universities goes on among, academics themselves, where they, in effect, will write journal articles that basically the audience is not the public at large, ultimately, but a handful of a dozen colleagues whom, in effect, they're engaged in debate with, walled off from the society. It wasn't always that way. And there was in years past the tradition, which is almost gone. There are a few exceptions. The tradition of the public intellectual. And I'm thinking of the great humanist John Dewey, who was a terrible teacher and a terrible speaker, a brilliant man, but when teachers were unionizing, he came out of the ivory tower and marched on picket lines to basically support the unionization of teachers. And when John Dewey made it a responsibility of his own to periodically come into public arenas and talk to the common man. And when he did, working class people, this is quite extraordinary, you couldn't think of it these days, working class people came out to hear what John Dewey was saying because they wanted to know what the great mind was thinking, in many ways. That phenomenon, think of Cooper Union, was founded on that basis in many ways, a public intellectual and a platform. That phenomenon, where there's some effort to integrate universities with society at large, that really doesn't exist. You have a type of cleavage there, a wall. And so I think academia itself is responsible if it's the object of contempt from ordinary people, because they've basically abnegated on a responsibility to be there to explain what the ideas for the common man and how it's applicable to the lives of real people. Another factor, I think, that sows the division between experts and ordinary people is that the knowledge handled by experts these days has in many cases become so abstract, so difficult and abstruse, that it's often opaque to even experts in the same fields that do not share certain subfields. This can readily lead the ordinary person to conclude that the truth put forward by experts is an effort to deceive and pull the wool over the eyes of the common man. But perhaps more corrupting still is that while experts are supposed to dispense objective knowledge, their objectivity is increasingly compromised. Some think tanks claim to be doing objective research, but they're in fact very partisan. Many researchers who claim to be independent are in fact dependent on very wealthy corporate sponsors and are putting forward their interests. And the more expertise is tied to wealthy interests, whether it be medicine, science, academia, the more ordinary people are prone to denounce their truths and their facts as a fraud or as an ideological hoax or fake news, pushing ahead their own interests. Okay. And so we have, the point here is we have elites and experts on one side of the divide, and we have on the other side the claim made for common sense, and with it the demand that ordinary people participate equally in government. It is Rosenfeld's thesis that democracy by its nature divides the people in this way, with each sector, the experts on the one hand and the common people on the other, each claiming their own version of what is true. Experts make their claims to what is true based on their expertise, and ordinary people rebel against the dispensation of experts in the name of common sense. As Rosenfeld notes, quote, populists, that's the ordinary folk, tend to reject science and its methods as a source of directives, embracing in many cases emotional honesty, intuition, and truths of the heart over dry factual veracity and scientific evidence testing and credentialing. Okay, think of Donald Trump again, who was able to intuit that and master that sensibility. I mean, the use of Twitter, by the way, is a way to speak directly to the people and bypass the filter of expertise or knowledge and so on and so forth, okay? But he's not the first one. Ronald Reagan, as I recall, was a master of appealing to this approach. As she states, Reagan insisted that he himself was no expert, he said, on anything, not even politics. Rather, he used anecdotes and was deceptively simple and used folksy turns of phrase. He also suggested that the kind of expertise associated with lawyers, economists, and other social scientists was unnecessary to determining the principles of governance. That was Ronald Reagan, just folks, okay? This rebellion against expert opinion, I think, can threaten standards of truth in several ways. It leads to a suspicion of expertise in general. It can readily dismiss abstraction and complexity, and it can lead to a conclusion that complex and intractable problems are really, at their base, very simple. Trump, again, himself exemplifies this contempt for expertise when he proclaims that he knows the Middle East better than the generals, okay, and he understands banking better than financial experts, okay? Or when James Inhofe, one of my really less liked senators, who was the former chair, this is really perverse, the former chair of the Senate Environmental Committee, debunked global warming, you might remember this, you can find it on YouTube, debunked global warming by bringing a snowball into the Senate chambers. Now, that's the reduction of complexity and climate science into the most basic, simple terms, right? It's a disdain for complexity. That is, and that's where this sort of thinking leads in the extreme. The point of Rosenfeld's thesis is that this division between experts and elites on one hand and faith and popular common sense of the common folk on the other leads to different concepts of the truth and is inherent to some degree in the nature of democracy, at least in terms of how democracy has evolved. This, she argues, however, and here it has to be very open-minded, this is not necessarily always totally a bad thing. Experts, in fact, are often arrogant, and they're often wrong, and need to be held accountable to challenges which come at times from the people themselves, okay? I mean, not always. I mean, I remember, and maybe this is the wrong thing, I remember when acupuncture was debunked. I mean, alternative medicine is a type of ordinary folk rebellion against experts and elites, and sometimes the people get it right. Do you know what I'm saying? And acupuncture was originally written off by the medical establishment as being, basically disreputable, and yet it's been absorbed by medicine and so forth. It came from below, not from above. So expertise is very often arrogant, has its own self-interests, as pointed out, and indeed it needs the corrective very often of popular pushback against it at times. I mean, that's the nature of democracy, okay? Democracy and the truths it arrives at are subject, and this is the virtue of democracy, are subject to change, and it is this flexibility and its openness to new ideas and new truths is one of the strengths of democracy. Democracy, in the final analysis, is a process and not a set of fixed truths which come from the experts or from the people at large, but from some uneasy dialectical process and mix of different perspectives, okay? But what is different here, and this is really the greatest concern, what is different and dangerous this time is that the nature of truth in areas where interpretation is possible is now being applied by right-wing populists to dismiss, ignore, undermine, and refute acts and truths about which there cannot be and should not be any debate, okay? One person says the world is round, and the next question is, well, let's basically open that up to debate. They have no difference. It is one thing to deny the truth that the economy is doing well, and another to assert that vaccines cause autism, or that George Soros is paying Islamic terrorists to cross our southern border. Okay. The problem with the current moment is that whereas democracy can deal with, and according to Rosenfeld is fated to deal with, however uneasily, with the first kind of truth, that is things that are pretty, not so clear and open to debate, society cannot endure the glib dismissal of facts around which there can be no justifiable debate or matters of interpretation. One example she gave of something that is open to discussion is that some historians may say that the Civil War was fought to end slavery, okay, as a fact. Well, again, that is something that is not, you know what I'm saying? It's not like triangles have three sides. That is something that is open to debate. But there are other things which are not. And the problem is that those things, the mentality that allows for debate, discussion, and so on, is now taken over, okay, and has flooded out a type of intellectual approach wherein things that are beyond debate are, in effect, now open for debate when they should not be. Well, let me end by saying, what has caused the assault of truth in our times? Rosenfeld assesses two sources, neither of which are at all surprising. One source, she believes, is the tremendous power of conservative talk radio and Fox News, which not only, works to propagandize for hardline Republicans and the demonization of the left, it also comes from their ability to delegitimize mainstream sources of information, which, despite their own biases and limitations and problems, still does try to make a good faith effort to report facts impartially and objectively. Her second concern is related to social media that turns everyone into a writer, a publisher, and propagandist, which, because of the profusion of voices, quoting again from David Bell in The Nation, drastically lowers the perceived differences between the New York Times, scientific journals, or the federal government on the one hand, and a dyspeptic relative expostulating at his keyboard on the other. In short, the ability of democratic societies to maintain common authoritative sources of truth in the face of reactionary demagogues and media provocateurs has drastically withered, producing vastly destabilizing consequences, end quote. Thinkers such as Jefferson and John Stuart Mill believe that the competition, and I believe this too, it's part of my faith, or it has been part of my faith, believe that the competition of different ideas would eventually allow the best ideas to rise up to the top, okay? John Stuart Mill was the main purveyor of this. You have to have open debate, freedom of expression and knowledge. Why? Because that exchange of ideas over time will sift, ideas will be sifted out, and almost like the laws of natural selection, the best ideas eventually through that process will rise to the top. But in order for this process, and this is crucial, in order for this sort of process to take place, okay, there has to be a lot of time. It takes a lot of time for that process to bring the best ideas up to the surface. The internet, I would argue, subverts that process, because in the briefest of times, it can send out unedited avalanches of information and misinformation, much deliberately promoted, which does not allow enough time for deliberation, reflection, mediation, and debate to ensure that the best ideas will indeed prevail. Okay. Moreover, further corrupting the truth is that a lot of untruths are fomented and underwritten by powerful business interests that have exploited populist sentiment depicting government regulation as elitist or which denigrate scientific expertise for their own capitalist interests. Think Rupert Murdoch or the Koch brothers and so on, that have fomented this type of criticism of science and so on, and stirred up populist sentiment for their own interest. So, bringing this to a close, what is to be done in the assault on the most basic truths? Well, certainly she proposes that fact-checking is important and necessary, but she admits its effects will be limited in that people who are committed to alternative facts are not much interested in the findings of fact-checkers. Okay, this is very well known. If you're involved in an argument with somebody whose beliefs are totally irrational, and you lay out a whole list of rational reasons as to why they're wrong, rather than convincing them, most likely you're just press them back into, and more deeply, into greater irrationality. You know, it's very galling in terms of dealing with these issues, right? But we need fact checkers. We just can't let, idiotic ideas basically win the day. You have to basically try to counter them with basic facts. Among the ideas that Rosenfeld suggests, and these are not particularly revolutionaries, that we need very strongly to defend an independent judiciary. We need to maintain the integrity of elections. We have to foster and protect investigative journalism, okay, which I think is essential. And we have to promote really high-quality higher education, among other things. But, and here I end on my own note, in my own humble opinion, the most sweeping and necessary way to restore a broad-based commitment to basic objective truths and to get beyond the tribalism and irrationalism so that we can heal the division, or at least begin to heal the division in American society, recognizing, and I agree with her, that in our democracy there will always be some competition coming from different quarters as to what is true. What we have to do, I think, is to close the extraordinary wealth gap in American society and restore an economy that allows for upward mobility and hope for a better future. I'm not, in a Marxist sense, a strict economic determinist, but I really do think economics does shape values, consciousness, beliefs to a greater degree than any other phenomenon in public life. Okay, we may have only an unemployment rate of only 3.8%, but the reality is that upward mobility is stalled in America. Today, if you are born into poverty, the chances are you will never work your way out of it. It is this stark reality confronting so many Americans, and especially the prospects of their children, that has driven them into the Trump camp and with it the disdain for facts and for truth. In short, people embrace irrational ideas when reality doesn't work for them anymore. And for too many people in America, reality has ceased to work. But the situation, I believe, let me end on a hopeful note, the situation, I believe, is by no means hopeless. While 40% of Americans may embrace Donald Trump and dismiss the claims of facts of truth, at the same time, okay, and I'm not overstating this, okay, don't get me wrong, I think it's an interesting anecdote. Subscriptions to the New York Times, on the other hand, have never been higher. They've risen dramatically. So now this is not to say that the New York Times is always right or always tells the truth or doesn't have its own interest, but it reflects a segment, a mentality that rejects, okay, the arrant denial of truth and is looking for, at least the New York Times, okay, strives to be reality-based and live in the reality-based world, okay? And the fact that many people have moved in that direction, okay, is not a bad sign. That's some little sign for hope. And finally, though ethical platforms need to veer away from being partisan, I know that. It is my view, I'm not making a partisan statement, I'm just being objective. It is my view that the Democratic Party, okay, will remain on the right track. This is making a broader political statement, and the Democratic Party just happens to be a momentary instantiation of this. My feeling is that the Democratic Party will remain on the right track as long as it forcefully, clearly, and intelligently emphasizes bread and butter issues. Healthcare, enlightened family support policies, a living wage, job security, retirement benefits, sick leave, job training for a new economy, quality education, and justice and inclusion with an increasingly diverse society. We need to radically revamp the tax structure in this society, radically turn it upside down, tax structure in this society, and create a dramatically greater egalitarian distribution of wealth. We need to strengthen the social safety net through the enactment of powerful federal laws that bring security, federal laws that bring security to all Americans. Now, if you think this is very radical, I ask you to read Franklin Roosevelt's last address to Congress, State of the Union address, in 1944. This goes back a long way. This is not new stuff, and it's not radical stuff. In 1944, as it was his last year, he was really quite ill at the time, he gave his last State of the Union address in which he called for a second Bill of Rights. And the second Bill of Rights was an economic Bill of Rights. He said, our first Bill of Rights in the Constitution gives us civil and political rights, but those alone cannot be enforced unless every American has an adequate income and feels, in effect, that he and she is economically secure. He then lays out 8 entitlements, including health care, that he feels, not that we're going to amend the Constitution again, but which he wants to see, in effect, enacted by federal laws guaranteeing them to every American, including housing, food, a decent job, okay, a busting of monopolies, okay, and healthcare, and several others. This is in 1944. Needless to say, he was not successful in bringing that to bear. These are not new ideas. We have to revive that type of argument, that type of position, if we're going to get beyond the culture of craziness, I think, okay? We have done it, and let me just say, in American history, we have done it before. In the progressive era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the economy was owned and controlled by robber barons and people were dying in factories, okay, and so on and so forth, we were able to transform American society and usher in, under Roosevelt, a New Deal, and then beyond that, after the war, a really sturdy middle class through the development of unions, and so on and so forth. We have to restore that type of economic outlook again. We have done it before. We have wrested control from the plutocrats, okay, before. We have to do it again. We need to do it, I would say, for the sake of justice. And when we do, I argue, we will be taking a giant step to preserving our democracy and, yes, friends, restoring sanity to America.